The laughter started before he even opened his mouth. 31 chefs, 3 Michelin-starred judges, and a room full of culinary industry executives watched as the cart carrying Henry Bosch's dish rolled to the front of the grand ballroom at the Chicago Food and Hospitality Summit. Someone near the back whispered loud enough for half the room to hear, "That's the guy from the truck stop diner in Ohio." A few people chuckled. One judge, a man whose name appeared on the covers of 4 different cookbooks, leaned toward his colleague and said something behind his hand that made both of them smile. Henry stood at the edge of the stage in a clean but clearly old white chef's coat, the kind that had been washed so many times the buttons no longer matched. He was 43 years old. His hands were rough in a way that had nothing to do with competition nerves. He didn't smile back at the judges. He didn't look down either, he just waited. Nobody in that ballroom understood what they were about to eat. If you believe that talent doesn't care where you come from, that grief doesn't erase greatness, and that the people who get overlooked the longest sometimes have the most to offer, stay with this story. Like this video if it moves you, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs to hear it right now, and subscribe to Dignity Tales for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Henry Bosch grew up in Mineral Ridge, a small township in northeastern Ohio, where the biggest employers were a stamping plant and a grocery distribution center. His mother worked the early shift at the grocery warehouse for 22 years. His father spent 12 years as a line cook at a Howard Johnson's before the location closed, and he never quite found his footing again. Food was always present in their house. Not fancy food, not food that anyone would photograph or review, but food that was made carefully, with attention, because when you don't have much, what you do with what you have matters enormously. Henry learned that in his mother's kitchen when he was 8 years old, standing on a step stool beside her at the stove, watching her stretch a pound of ground beef into a meal for 5 people. She wasn't doing anything magical. She was just paying attention to the heat, to the smell, to the exact moment when the onions softened and the kitchen changed. He never forgot that. By the time Henry was 25, he had worked in 7 different kitchens across 3 states, mostly the kind of places that didn't make lists. Roadside diners, family restaurants with laminated menus, one brief stint at a mid-range hotel in Columbus that he still considered his most educational experience, because the executive chef there, a quiet Haitian-American man named No One Famous, taught him that simplicity executed perfectly beats complexity executed carelessly every single time. Henry absorbed everything. He worked doubles without complaining. He came in early to practice knife work on his own time. He read cookbooks the way other people read novels, obsessively, in bad light, long after everyone else had gone home. At 29, he met Claire Bosch, born Claire Albrecht, at a farmer's market in Youngstown where she sold preserves, and he was shopping for stone fruit on his day off. She was the kind of person who made every room feel slightly more organized just by being in it. Not controlling, just present. Aware. She remembered people's names the second time she met them, and never had to pretend she did. Henry fell for her. The afternoon she spent 40 minutes explaining to an elderly man why different varieties of this plum tasted differently depending on when they were picked. She wasn't selling anything in that moment. She was just genuinely interested in making sure he understood. They married 2 years later. Their daughter Nessa was born the year after that. Not from this list, Henry named her after Claire's grandmother, a woman who had emigrated from outside Budapest, with almost nothing, and built a life in western Pennsylvania through what she described as stubbornness, dressed up as optimism. Henry worked, Claire worked. They saved enough to lease a small space in Millfield, Ohio, a town of 11,000 people that had one Thai restaurant, a pizza chain, and 3 bars, and opened a place they called Groundwork. Nothing fancy, 16 tables, a menu that changed every few weeks based on what was available locally. Henry cooked, Claire ran everything else. They were not profitable for the first 2 years. They were not reviewed by anyone significant. They were not on any list. But people came back. That was the thing. People who ate at Groundwork came back, and they brought someone with them, and that person came back too. Henry had a way of making food that felt like it already knew you. Familiar but not boring. Comforting in a way that didn't feel lazy. Then, 3 weeks before Nessa's 6th birthday, Claire sat down at the kitchen table after her evening shift at the restaurant, and told Henry her left arm had been feeling strange for a few days. Not painful, just strange. He drove her to the emergency room at midnight, because something in her voice made him not want to wait until morning. They found a mass, then another. Then the scan that made the doctor set down her pen. The next 14 months were the kind that collapsed time. Everything that seemed permanent turned impermanent overnight. Everything Henry thought he understood about the future disappeared so quickly. It felt like it had never existed. He cooked through most of it, because cooking was the only thing that kept his hands busy enough that his mind couldn't wander somewhere he couldn't come back from. He reduced groundwork's hours. He hired an additional person to cover his shifts when Claire's appointments ran long. He drove Nessa to school every morning and picked her up every afternoon and answered her questions as honestly as a father can, when the honest answer is, "I don't know how this ends." Claire died on a Tuesday in late October, the kind of day where the sky goes entirely gray before noon and stays that way. She was 36 years old, Nessa was 7. Henry closed groundwork for 3 weeks after the funeral. When he reopened it, he almost didn't. He stood in the kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, alone, and didn't move for a long time. Then he turned the burners on, not because he felt ready, but because Nessa had asked him the night before if the restaurant was coming back. Not because she cared about the restaurant, because she was watching him to see if he was going to be okay. And she needed to believe the answer was yes. He kept cooking. What else could he do? The years that followed were not a clean recovery. Anyone who tells you grief has stages, and then resolves, is selling a story that grief itself doesn't cooperate with. Henry had months that were genuinely good, where groundwork hummed along, where Nessa did well in school, where he slept without waking at 3 in the morning, to an empty side of the bed. And he had months where none of those things were true simultaneously. What he had, consistently, was the kitchen. Not as therapy, exactly, not as escape. More like a room where the rules hadn't changed, where heat behaved the same way it always had, where the relationship between fat and acid and salt remained stable, regardless of what was happening outside. In a life that had become profoundly unstable, the kitchen was the one place where Henry still understood the language completely. He started doing something unusual during this period, quietly, without announcing it to anyone. He began reconstructing recipes from memory. Not his own recipes, his mother's, his grandmother's, reconstructed from descriptions his mother had given him years before she passed. Recipes from the cookbooks he'd read in his 20s, that he'd never had occasion to make. Old Midwestern farmhouse dishes that nobody under 50 could find anymore. Depression-era techniques for stretching ingredients that food culture had mostly forgotten because it now seemed unnecessary to know how to make a lot from a little. He was trying to preserve something. He didn't fully understand what. Some nights, while Nessa did her homework at the prep table beside him, and an old radio played in the background, he'd be working on some forgotten braise, or a clarification technique that hadn't been fashionable since the 19th. And he'd look up and realize an hour had passed, without him noticing. Those were his good hours. Nessa grew up in that kitchen. By age 10 she could identify a properly sautéed shallot by smell. By 12 she had opinions about bread. She used to sit on a stainless steel stool beside the pass-through, and announce her verdict on whatever Henry was testing, with the complete confidence of someone whose judgment has never once been questioned. "Too much time, Dad. I can smell it from here." Usually she was right. Henry never entered competitions. It wasn't modesty. It was more that competition had never seemed like the point. He was cooking to feed people, and feeding people didn't require validation from a panel of strangers. Besides, groundwork needed him. A 16-table restaurant in Millfield, Ohio didn't run itself. The invitation to the summit came from a culinary society he'd joined years ago, mostly because the membership included a quarterly journal he actually read. The invitation was generic. An open call for regional chefs to submit a dish for consideration in the summit's Emerging Talent Showcase. Henry almost didn't respond. Nessa found the invitation on the corner of his desk in March, read it, and left it on top of his coffee mug the next morning, with a sticky note that said, "You should do this." She was 14 by then, and had developed a teenage directness that Claire would have found both exasperating and deeply satisfying. He submitted. He was accepted. He drove to Chicago, in his 2009 pickup truck, with a cooler in the back, and Nessa asleep in the passenger seat, before they even reached Indiana. The summit was exactly what Henry expected it to be, and nothing he was prepared for. Chefs with publicists, chefs with social media followings, chefs whose restaurants existed in cities where rent per square foot exceeded what Henry paid for his entire building. The lobby of the hotel smelled like money and ambition in roughly equal proportion. Henry checked in, found his room, and ate a gas station sandwich on the edge of the bed while reading the summit program. His slot was the following afternoon. That evening, he walked through the hotel's showcase kitchen, where other competing chefs were setting up their prep stations. One chef from New York, young, with the particular kind of confident carelessness that comes from being celebrated early, looked at Henry's station and then at his truck stop knife roll and said, with genuine puzzlement rather than malice, "Where are you from again?" Henry told him. The chef nodded slowly in the way people nod when the information they've received confirms something they suspected. Henry went to sleep at 10, he was up at 4:30 out of habit. He had brought everything himself. Not because the summit didn't provide kitchen access, it did. But because every component of what he was making had been sourced from farms within 60 miles of Millfield. He had spent weeks working on this dish, and weeks before that understanding what he was actually trying to do. Because what Henry had decided to make was not what most people at a competition like this made. He was not making something innovative. He was not making something that required an explanation of its molecular structure, or a diagram showing the origin of its inspiration. He was making a dish rooted in the farmhouse cooking of the Midwest between 1930 and 1960. Updated with the precision he'd spent 20 years developing. But fundamentally honest about where it came from. An oxtail braise with hand-rolled spätzle, a celery root preparation done 3 ways, and a pan sauce built over 4 hours from beef bones and aromatics and nothing artificial. The judges, when they reviewed the submitted descriptions ahead of the competition, had rated his entry technically adequate, but conceptually unambitious. That assessment got back to him, through the society liaison. He thanked her for letting him know. The laughter, when it came the next afternoon, didn't surprise him. Not because he expected cruelty, because he understood that what he was presenting looked, on the surface, like exactly the kind of thing sophisticated palates had moved past 20 years ago. Braised oxtail, spätzle, a root vegetable preparation. Nobody at this summit was celebrating that category. Nobody at this summit had come to be reminded of their grandmother's kitchen. The cart rolled in, the whispers started. One of the younger industry observers near the back said something that made the people around him laugh quietly. A chef Henry had spoken briefly with in the hallway. That morning watched his dish arrive, and looked away with an expression of polite preemptive disappointment. Henry stood at the edge of the stage. Nessa was in the 3rd row. She had driven separately. Her friend's mother had brought her up after school. She was sitting very still, watching her father, with the particular expression she'd worn since she was small. When she understood something important was happening, but was not yet sure which way it was going to go. The head judge, a woman named Patricia Fowler Hayes, who had spent 30 years in the food industry, and written more about American culinary tradition than almost anyone else working, lifted the cover from Henry's dish. She looked at it for a moment, she said nothing. Then she picked up her fork. What happened next was something Henry had no way to engineer, and no way to predict. It was the smell that changed the room first. Not immediately, it took a few seconds, the way a sound takes time to travel. But the braise had been developing for hours, and what had been contained under the cover expanded into the ballroom slowly, and then all at once, and it was the specific smell of something made with genuine patience. Not technique for its own sake. Patience. The smell of a kitchen where someone had been paying attention since before anyone else woke up. Patricia Fowler Hayes took her first bite. She set her fork down. She looked at the dish again, differently this time. Then she picked the fork back up, and ate in the careful, quiet way that people eat when they have forgotten that anyone is watching them. The second judge, a man named Gilbert Corso, who ran the culinary program at a major Chicago institution, and had been visibly unimpressed during the earlier portion of the afternoon, leaned forward and took a portion without waiting for the formal rotation. He chewed slowly. Then he looked at Gilbert across the table. Actually looked at him. Not the way judges look at each other to silently coordinate a verdict, but the way people look at each other when something unexpected has happened, and they need to confirm it was real. The third judge was a younger woman, a food writer and restaurateur, whose commentary on the competition circuit was followed closely by people who cared about these things. She ate. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she wrote something in her notebook and underlined it. Nobody was laughing now. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone has simultaneously understood that something is happening that they don't have the right language for yet. Patricia Fowler Hayes addressed Henry directly. She said, "Tell me about the sauce." And Henry talked, not the way competitors talk, with rehearsed origin stories and polished descriptions of their culinary philosophy. He talked the way he talked to Nessa when she asked him about something in the kitchen. Plain, specific. He explained the bones, and the time, and the reduction, and what he was trying to get the collagen to do. He explained that the Spätzle used a ratio he'd found in a handwritten recipe from a farmhouse cookbook printed in Indiana in 1944, and that he'd spent 6 weeks adjusting it, until it held exactly the right texture against the braise. He explained that the celery root preparation was 3 different expressions of the same ingredient because he'd become interested in how one vegetable could carry entirely different emotional weight depending on how it was handled. Patricia Fowler Hayes said, "Emotional weight." Henry said, "Yes." She said, "Say more about that." He said, "Food from this region and this era was made by people who were cooking out of necessity, but they were also cooking to make something worth sitting down for. That's not sentimental, that's practical. There's a kind of intelligence in it that got written off as old-fashioned, and I've been trying to understand it for 20 years. This dish is what I've figured out so far." Patricia didn't write anything down. She didn't need to. Henry did not win the summit's top prize. He won something different. The Fowler Hayes recognition, a distinction Patricia had given out 3 times in 15 years of judging, and which she described in her remarks as reserved for work that changes how she thinks about a category, rather than simply excelling within it. It came with no trophy. It came with a handshake and a letter that she read aloud to the room, and which ended with the sentence, "This chef is doing something that most of this industry has forgotten was worth doing." The applause started slowly. Then it didn't. But the moment that Nessa would still talk about years later happened afterward, outside the ballroom, in the wide carpeted hallway, near the elevators. Henry was walking out, carrying his knife roll, not looking at anything in particular, when he heard his name. He turned around. It was the young chef from New York. The one with the publicist. The one who'd looked at Henry's station with genuine puzzlement. He was standing a few feet away, and he looked different from the afternoon, not humbled exactly. More like someone who had encountered something they hadn't been prepared for and were still working out how to feel about it. He said, "That oxtail. I've been in this industry for 12 years. I've never tasted anything like that." Henry said, "Thank you." The young chef said, "What's your restaurant called?" Henry told him, "Groundwork, Millfield, Ohio." The young chef nodded, then he said, "I'm going to come eat there." Henry said, "I'll be there." He meant it literally, he would be there. That was where he lived. That was where Nessa went to school, and where Claire was buried, and where the farmers he sourced from ran their operations, and where 16 tables waited for whoever walked through the door. He wasn't going anywhere. 3 weeks after the summit, Patricia Fowler Hayes published a long piece in a widely read food journal. It was not a review of Groundwork she hadn't visited yet. It was an essay about what she'd experienced in Chicago, about the dish Henry had made, about a quality she called earned restraint. The particular kind of skill that only develops in someone who has been cooking seriously for decades, without external validation, cooking because the work itself required it, rather than because anyone was watching. She mentioned the oxtail. She mentioned the Spätzle ratio from the 1944 Indiana cookbook. She mentioned the way the celery root had been handled. And she mentioned, briefly, what Henry had said about emotional weight. Not quoting him directly, but describing the conversation in a way that made clear she'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks. The piece was shared widely, in the way that pieces about food only rarely are. It reached people who had no direct connection to professional cooking. People who shared it because something in it connected to something else they had been trying to articulate about work and loss, and the things you keep doing because they're the right things to do, regardless of whether anyone notices. The reservation line at Groundwork rang for 2 days straight. Henry had to hire someone just to handle the phone. Patricia Fowler Hayes drove to Millfield on a Thursday in April, 2 months after the summit. She came alone, in a sensible car, and she sat at a table in the corner, and ordered what was on the menu that week, and didn't tell anyone in advance she was coming except Henry, who got the call 2 days before, and told Nessa, who said I knew it, and then immediately went quiet, because she was trying not to make too big a deal of it. After dinner, Patricia sat with Henry in the kitchen. Nessa was at a friend's house, and they talked for 2 hours about food, and about Ohio, and about the years between when someone has something to say and when the right person happens to be in the room to hear it. At some point, Patricia said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Henry said, okay, she said, why didn't you compete sooner? Henry thought about it. He thought about Claire in the hospital. He thought about Nessa on the prep stool announcing her verdicts on his test dishes. He thought about the 1944 cookbook and the weeks of adjustments, and the bones he'd put on at 4:30 in the morning in an empty kitchen in Millfield, Ohio, with nobody watching. He said, I wasn't doing it for anyone to see. Patricia looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I know, that's why it was worth seeing. Before she left, she mentioned that she sat on the advisory board of a new culinary foundation, being established in partnership with 3 major industry organizations. The foundation would fund long-term residencies for chefs, working in what she called the preservation and evolution of regional American cooking traditions, a category that had historically received almost no institutional support. She said the board was looking for someone to help shape the program's first year. She said she couldn't make promises, but she was going to put his name forward. Henry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my wife used to say that the only things worth doing are the ones you'd do whether anyone was looking or not. Patricia said, she was right. He said, she usually was. The foundation appointment was confirmed 6 weeks later. Henry Bosch, chef, single father, owner of a 16-table restaurant in Millfield, Ohio, was named the inaugural culinary director of the American Farmhouse Kitchen Foundation, responsible for identifying, documenting, and developing regional cooking traditions that had been disappearing from the cultural record for 50 years. The announcement mentioned his name and his restaurant. It did not mention the laughter in the ballroom, because no one from the organization knew about it. But Henry knew, and Nessa knew, and a few people who had been in that room knew, and some of them had the honesty to be uncomfortable about it, in a way that was probably useful. On the morning the announcement went public, Henry drove Nessa to school. It was a regular Thursday. She had a history test second period and a volleyball game after school, and had spent 40 minutes the night before trying to get him to quiz her on the causes of the First World War, which he had done, badly, while making stock. She got out of the truck in the school parking lot, pulled her backpack over one shoulder, and then turned back before she closed the door. She said, Mom would have thought this was cool. Henry said, yeah, she would have. Nessa said, she also would have said don't let it go to your head. He laughed. Actually laughed, which Nessa clocked, with the particular satisfaction of a teenager whose jokes have landed. She closed the door and walked into school without looking back. Henry sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, engine running, watching the building like he always did until she was inside. Then he drove back to Groundwork. He had a prep shift starting at 9. 6 months into the foundation directorship, Henry was invited to speak at a regional culinary conference in Columbus. The organizers asked him to talk about the Midwest farmhouse cooking tradition, where it came from, what had been lost, what was worth recovering. He agreed. He stood at a podium in front of 200 food professionals, and said almost exactly what he'd said to Patricia Fowler Hayes in the Chicago ballroom. That there was a kind of intelligence in that old cooking that had been dismissed as nostalgia. And that dismissing it was a mistake, because the people who developed those techniques were solving real problems with the materials they had, and the solutions they found were worth understanding on their own terms. He showed slides of the 1944 cookbook. He showed slides of his celery root preparation. He talked about his mother standing at a stove in Mineral Ridge, stretching a pound of ground beef into dinner for 5, and how that wasn't a story about poverty. It was a story about attention. A woman in the 4th row was crying quietly. She wasn't the only one. After the talk, a line formed. Henry shook hands and answered questions for an hour. The last person in line was a young cook, maybe 22, who had driven from Cleveland. She said she worked at a farm-to-table restaurant that was struggling to find its identity, and that what he'd said about simplicity executed with precision had answered a question she'd been asking for 3 years. Henry said, "What question?" She said, "Whether it was okay to cook the food I actually came from, instead of the food I thought I was supposed to aspire to." Henry said, "That's always been the question, the answer's yes." She thanked him, he thanked her back, he meant it. On a cold Saturday in December, Henry drove out to one of the farms he sourced from, 20 minutes east of Millfield. The farmer, a third-generation man with acreage that had been in his family since the 1930s, had called to say he had late-season storage vegetables left over and didn't know if Henry could use them. Henry came out to look. They walked the rows in the cold, neither of them talking much. The farmer showed him what he had: parsnips, turnips, a surprising amount of good-quality celeriac, some late-harvested leeks. Henry crouched beside one of the celeriac, turned it over in his hands. He thought about the dish he'd made in Chicago. He thought about how long it had taken him to understand what he was actually doing when he was developing it. He thought about Claire in the restaurant in those early years, closing up after service, turning off lights, making sure the walk-in was properly sealed before she'd let them go home. He thought about Nessa's verdict: "Too much time, Dad. I can smell it from here." He stood up. He said to the farmer, "I'll take all of it." The farmer looked at him. Henry said, "I have an idea for something." The farmer nodded. He'd heard this before. Every time Henry came out here he had an idea for something, and whatever it became, it was usually worth eating. The last thing Patricia Fowler Hayes wrote about Henry, not for the journal this time, but in the foreword of a cookbook she was editing, a collection of regional American recipes being published with the Foundation's support, was a single paragraph. She wrote that she had eaten thousands of meals in 40 years of working in food, prepared by some of the most celebrated hands in the country, in rooms that cost more per night than most people earn in a month. She wrote that she had sat at tables where the food was genuinely extraordinary, and the experience was genuinely moving. And she wrote that she had also eaten at a 16-table restaurant in Millfield, Ohio, on a Thursday in April, where a widowed father had made her a bowl of soup from storage vegetables and bone broth, and something she could only describe as accumulated years of paying attention, and that it was the most honest meal she had ever eaten in her life. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. Some things can only be made by someone who has been doing the work, long after any reasonable person would have expected recognition. In a kitchen where nobody famous has ever eaten, for a daughter sitting on a stainless steel stool, who announces her verdicts with complete confidence, because no one has ever told her that her opinion doesn't count. That kind of cooking takes a specific kind of life to produce. Henry Bosch had lived it. Every single day. And now, finally, the right people were paying attention. Before we go, has there been a moment in your life when you kept doing something quietly, without recognition, because it was simply the right thing to do? Tell us in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe to Dignity Tales for more stories about the people who do the work, before anyone is watching.